I got a comment on my Generation Jones video a couple of weeks ago that I've really been thinking about. The person said Generation Jones doesn't exist. Made up. A marketing term. If you were born between 1946 and 1964, you're a boomer. Case closed. End of argument. Fair enough. I've heard that before. But then in the same comment, he told me he was a Xennial, a real, distinct, separate microgeneration sitting between Gen X and Millennials. Not Gen X, not a Millennial, a Xennial. Yeah, I found that interesting. You'd think that someone who shares so many traits with Millennials could see the irony in his statement. Or maybe he was channeling his Gen X side and was using sarcasm, in which case, well played, sir. Here's the thing. He's not wrong about either claim, but you can't argue that one invented label is a myth while wrapping your entire identity in a different invented label. That's not logic. That's just selective nostalgia. Either way, he accidentally proved my point, and today I want to prove his. So, what actually is a Xennial? Well, the birth years get debated. The most commonly accepted window is 1977 to 1983, but some researchers start as early as 1975 and as late as 1985. But the point isn't the exact dates. The point is the experience. Xennials are the people who had an analog childhood and a digital adulthood. That sentence sounds simple. It's not, because it describes something that happened only once. For most of human history, change happened slowly enough that parents and children largely lived in the same world. Then, in the span of a single childhood, the world went from analog to digital. Xennials are the only cohort who fully remember the before time and then personally lived through the transition to the after. They remember a world without the internet. They also built their adult lives on it. That's not a footnote. That's a split identity. Now, depending on the definition used, around 30 million Americans were born during the years often associated with Xennials. It's a lot of Xennials, which is surprising considering the large number that died of dysentery on the Oregon Trail. In fact, some people call them the Oregon Trail generation, named for the game they played in elementary school on Apple IIe computers, which was, looking back, a remarkably casual way to teach children about cholera and wagon wheel failure. You probably forded the river when you should have caulked the wagon. You know who you are. And that game, that specific experience, tells you everything. They were in school early enough to have a computer in the classroom, but they went home to a world with no internet, no cell phones, and just a handful of television channels. Those two realities didn't conflict, they just coexisted. That's a Xennial childhood. Now, here's where my commenter's argument falls apart under its own weight. Why does every microgeneration feel real to the people inside it? Look, I've talked about Generation Jones on this channel, born 1954 to 1964, roughly. You've heard it all before. Too young to be Woodstock boomers, too old to be latchkey Gen X. They came of age in the long hangover after the counterculture. 18% mortgage rates, the Arab oil embargo, Carter-era malaise, stagflation. They came of age in an America that was actively falling apart. Does that sound like the same generation that marched on Washington and smoked something behind the stage at Altamont? No, that's not a subtle distinction. That's a different world wearing the same label. Xennials also came of age right as the world was transforming. They didn't get the stability of Gen X's analog independence. They didn't grow up digital like millennials. They got the seam, the gap, the weird in-between years where everything was changing and nobody had a name for what was coming. See, people don't fight for their generational label because they're being precious. They fight for it because the broader label doesn't explain them. When someone born in 1981 gets called a millennial, a lot of them feel like the word doesn't fit. And they're right, it doesn't. Not entirely, because the millennial experience gets talked about. Helicopter parents, participation trophies, social media native childhood. That's not them. They were already in college or the workforce when social media showed up. So they needed a word, and the word they found is Xennial. My commenter needed a word too. He just didn't think anyone else should get one. So let's actually build the Xennial case, because it's stronger than most people give it credit for. The analog-digital split is the headline, but the specifics matter. A person born in 1980 graduated high school in 1998. The internet existed, barely. AOL dial-up, the sound of a modem connecting, that squeal, that's a Xennial audio landmark. You waited 3 minutes for a web page to load. You got off the internet when your mom needed to use the phone. You remember that. Cell phones existed too, but not for you. Not yet. You maybe got your first one in college. You didn't take it to high school, so your entire high school social world, the drama, the rumors, the heartbreak, all that happened in person. No receipts, no screenshots, no permanent record. Then MySpace launched in 2003, and Facebook followed in 2004. You were already in your 20s. You didn't grow up with social media. You watched it arrive. You didn't shape your formative years the way it shaped a millennial born in 1990. You adopted it. You weren't born into it. That's a crucial distinction. Social media as a tool versus social media as the water you swim in. Then, 2008. The Great Recession hit Xennials at 25 to 31, not as teenagers, not as established professionals, right in the prime career building window, the moment when you're supposed to be getting traction, building credit, buying a home, climbing the ladder. And the entire system lurched sideways. If that sounds familiar, it should, because I've said this before. History doesn't shape you most when it happens. It shapes you when it interrupts your coming of age. For Xennials, 2008 was that interruption, and the result is a generation that doesn't trust the ladder quite the same way younger millennials were taught to. They carry a Gen X pragmatism about institutions. Not cynicism exactly, just clear eyes. A quiet expectation that the floor might drop. That's not Gen X. That's not millennial. That is Xennial. This brings me back to my commenter. He rejected Generation Jones. He accepted Xennials. He called one a myth and the other an identity. What if he was right on both counts, but for the wrong reasons? Because here's what I think happened. He was doing two things at once without realizing it. He was being skeptical of someone else's label, which is very Gen X of him. Independent, doesn't need your framework. That's made up is essentially Gen X's default mode for anything institutional. At the same time, he was defending his own label, staking a claim. I exist, I'm distinct, see me, which is very millennial of him. The generation that turned identity into a practice. He was doing both at the same time. And that right there is the Xennial experience in a single comment. Xennial's code switch, They move between Gen X skepticism and millennial identity fluency without even noticing. They speak both languages, not perfectly, but well enough. That's not really a blurring of the lines, that's a distinct trait. The ability to function in both worlds is the definition of the in-between generation. So, was he being sarcastic? Yeah, maybe. That'd be peak Gen X. But whether he meant to or not, he proved that Xennials are real by being one in the comments section. Here's what I want to leave you with. Every generational label is constructed. Someone made it up. Boomer comes from a post-war birth spike. Gen X was a novel title. Millennial was coined by researchers in 1991. Xennial was coined by journalist Sarah Stankorb in 2014. Nobody gets to claim their label is natural and someone else's is artificial. The real question has never been whether those labels are real. The question is, what does this label capture that the bigger box misses? For Xennials, the answer is specific. It captures the people who lived through the transition, who remember the before time and built their lives in the after, who got the internet but weren't consumed by it as children, who had analog resilience and digital adaptability, not because they were trained for it, but because they had no choice. Generationally, they're like people who grew up speaking two languages at home. They're not confused, they're fluent in both. That's not a deficit, that's a skill. So, to my commenter, if you're still out there, you were right. Xennials are real. I'd also gently suggest that Generation Jones is real, but I understand if that's a bridge too far. You can take your time with that one. So here's what I want to know. If you're a Xennial, or if you're someone who's been told that you're one generation when you feel like you're something else, what specific experience makes the broader label wrong for you? Was it the dial-up modem? The 2008 recession hitting at exactly the wrong moment? The code switching between your Gen X instincts and your millennial coworkers? Drop it in the comments below. And if this hit right, go ahead and hit the hype, like, and subscribe buttons. Consider it your small contribution to rescuing your fellow Xennials from dying of dysentery on the Oregon Trail. And remember, every generation is basically a made-up social construct, just like everything else in society. The labels are made up. The experiences aren't. Thanks for watching.